Hello, everybody. Welcome to the talk on Dolly Chugh's new book, A More Just Future. This event is hosted by NYU's Center for the Future of Management. My name is Rob Siemens. I'm the director of the center. These events are held semi-regularly, and we will mention about our next one at the end of today's talk. Here's the format. We're going to start with a brief introduction of Dolly and Victor. And then they're going to launch into a moderated Q&A. They'll have a nice discussion. While they're having their discussion, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A feature to enter your questions. And Victor and Dolly will make sure to get to as many of those as they can. Okay, so let me provide some introductions. So Professor Dolly Chugh is an award-winning professor at the New York University Stern School of Business, where she teaches MBA courses in leadership and management. Her research focuses on bounded ethicality, which she describes as the psychology of good people. She is the author of The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias. It was published by HarperCollins in 2018. A More Just Future, published by Simon & Schuster in 2022, and the popular Dear Good People newsletter. Dolly's TED Talk was named one of the 25 most popular TED Talks of 2018 and currently has almost 5 million views. Prior to becoming an academic, Dolly worked at Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Simpson & Company, Scholastic, and Time Inc. Dolly attended Cornell University, where she majored in psychology and economics for her undergraduate degree, and Harvard University for her MBA and PhD. Victor Mullins is the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the NYU Stern School of Business. Prior to his current position at NYU, Victor was an Associate Dean at the University of Maryland and an Associate Dean at the University of Illinois. Victor received his BA from George Mason University and his MA and PhD from New York University. So with that, we're going to hand things over to Victor and Dolly.
Thank you, Rob. And Dolly, I so look forward to this conversation. As I was sharing with you earlier, that I got to know you better reading this book.
Oh.
And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. Now, let me just start with this. You said that you are scared to publish this book, that you don't doubt the value of what you're writing, but you know that it will upset a few people. I just wanted you just to hone in on, then why did you write this book and what was your intention when writing it?
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for doing this. I was really excited that you said yes, both to join Stern, to come back to Stern and be part of our new chapter and to be part of this conversation. And thank you to Rob and to Anne and Signe and Harry and Patrick for their great work bringing us together today. Victor, you really went for the therapy question. Well, I wrote this book because it's the book I felt I needed to read, and I couldn't find it out there. And I think that's been that's kind of been the space I have carved out for myself in the past few years as a social psychologist. Is I produce research like many of my colleagues, but I also consume research as a human being. And so much of it is so useful, but unless you're in the field and in the journals, you wouldn't even know about this research. So I was looking for tools to help me cope with moments like me spending an entire year reading the Little House on the Prairie book series to my children. At the time, they were around 5, 6 years old. Every night for a year, I was like patting myself on the back, Mom of the Year, that we were reading aloud every night. We were stuck with the same series for a whole year with 8 books, 200 pages each. And that I was like feeding them this beautiful narrative of hard work and family and patriotism. So much so that my husband and I decided to spend our family vacation the following year going to the spaces that were discussed in the book. The series is by Laura Ingalls about her family in the 1800s. And so we went to Minnesota and South Dakota and like visited all the spots, and our kids ran around in prairie dresses all week, like pretending they were the Ingalls girls. And I remember standing like literally on a prairie with like a big blue sky above and these cute kids running around in prairie dresses, and suddenly having a thought that I'm embarrassed to say had not really hit me until that moment of whose land was this little house built on? And how did that land get taken from them, and why? And what happened to those families? And what happened to those communities and cultures and economies and rituals? And where is it? And how come I didn't tell my kids about those families as well? There was nothing wrong with telling them about the Ingalls family, but it was only part of the story. And in that moment, I wish I could say I Googled some stuff and started a conversation with my kids. But what I really did was just shut down because I did not know how to cope. Intellectually, I understood what was, what this was about. But emotionally, there was like shame and guilt and disbelief that I had been sort of so narrowly teaching my kids a partial history of my country. And I didn't even know more myself. And so this book comes from a place of over the last decade, wishing I had done better in that moment and so many other moments, and wishing I hadn't set my kids up to have to unlearn a bunch of stuff that I taught them, as well as my own unlearning. And so I wrote a book that I was scared to write because it was going to confront some of the darker moments of our country's history, not as a historian, because I'm not one, but as a psychologist who's interested in how we engage with our emotions and with other people, past and present. And I worried that not everyone would understand my intent, that I'm writing this from a place of love, not a place of hate or anything else.
You know, I love the way that you started the entire book with there's so much to unlearn. And to unlearn is uncomfortable, as you know, for a lot of people. You said that it's the process of untangling systems that our mind has justified, especially when those systems do not serve us. And you also said to decolonize is to unlearn. Can you just elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're really fortunate at NYU. Just down the street in the psychology department, we have the groundbreaking work that's been done by psychologist John Jost on system justification theory. His theory, if I were to oversimplify it, I've oversimplified it by calling it the good guys win mindset. And that's the tendency our minds have to unconsciously justify things the way they are, even when things the way they are may not benefit us specifically or the identities we hold or the communities we belong to, but we still look for ways to sort of justify that things are the way they are because the good guys won. And so that's one of the elements of the psychology behind this. And then you add to it that in addition to our just natural psychology, there's also a reality that in the United States, there's a history of Black and Brown people being discriminated against overtly and more implicitly throughout our country's history. And that's led to a set of systems. And now these are like legal systems, cultural systems, housing systems, healthcare systems, economic systems, and so on, in which we can see really obvious disparities on every meaningful life outcome in the United States. There are racial disparities in 2023. I mean, that's sort of stunning. And in order to understand that, I mean, there's lots of possible explanations. And as a scientist, I'm interested in exploring them. But one of the things that, as a psychologist, I'm particularly interested in is what are the ways our minds have sort of set ourselves up to think that that's just the way it is. And so decolonizing our minds means questioning those disparities, questioning the narratives behind the disparities.
Am I correct in assuming that in order for one to seek a more just future, driving social change, that they have to, what you say, reckon? And I want you to actually give your definition of reckoning, because I loved how you narrated that definition in the book. And then the second part of the question actually touches on what you just left off with, the notion of, for one to unlearn, means that we are assuming that they do want to drive social change. Or am I just jumping too of an optimist here?
Well, okay, so let's start with reckoning. I was really interested because the word reckoning was getting used a lot. I started writing this book in 2019. The word reckoning was not being used a lot. But over the course of writing this book, 2020 happened, and then we were hearing the word reckoning like everywhere. And so I was using it myself, and then I looked it up, and I was actually really surprised that the definition, the dictionary definition, which I don't know if I can quickly put my hands on it in the book itself. So here it is. It's reckoning as, quote, the action or process of calculating or estimating something. Another definition, settlement of accounts as between companies. I mean, coming from a business school, this is like so cool, right? Another one is a statement of an amount due, a bill. And so I commented, these definitions evoke accountant more than robed God, because I've heard reckoning as something very meta and spiritual, like, we must reckon. But this is more like we must document, we must tabulate. And I think that's a really important place to start with thinking about this word reckoning, of before it becomes one of moral judgment and emotional charge. It has to first be one where we simply have the knowledge and the documentation. And a lot of that is where I'm lacking. Like, I don't have that knowledge. There's a lot about our country's history I'm unaware of. I was not taught. I didn't show a lot of interest in. It was not covered in our textbooks, that I'm just seeing now. And so that bit of reckoning is let's just correct the narrative. Let's look at the movies and the holidays and the sort of the customs we have and just examine them a little more critically. I don't mean I'm not really a history buff, to be told. It's sort of weird that I wrote this book, but it just means like we're constantly consuming history. We're nostalgia buffs, all of us. Let's look at our nostalgia a little more closely. So that's the reckoning piece of it. I forgot what the second. You said a second part was.
Yes. Do you think that in order to drive social change, you have to reckon? I mean, is there step 2? Or do they happen simultaneously?
Yeah. Well, I think I increasingly believe that. I wouldn't have known that a few years ago, but I'm increasingly persuaded by research that says it's important. So, for example, psychologist Via Salter and her colleagues have done work where they have looked at our ability to detect examples of systemic racism in the present is improved when we have just a little bit more knowledge about the past. I mean, like literally a paragraph or two was the manipulation they were giving the experimental condition. And so this just little bit more of insight into what came before seems to really open up our eyes to what we're seeing today. And so that work like that has really opened up my eyes to thinking about the power of, I've been describing it as reading pages 1 to 99 in a book instead of just starting at page 100. I mean, right? Like if you just pick up an action thriller on page 100 and you don't have access to what came before, you're going to have to like piece together what's going on. You're going to have to make sense of things without the information. You'll probably guess wrong half the time. And I think what I've realized is that's what I've been doing my whole life and what many of us have been doing when we don't really, when we had textbooks that didn't explain to us that many of our founding fathers enslaved other human beings while they wrote the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. I mean, I didn't know that until very recently when we learned about the GI Bill as being what led to the rise of the American middle class, an increase in home ownership and an increase in college attendance. But we didn't learn that the GI Bill was basically only accessible to white veterans, not Black veterans. These are moments where we've missed pages 1 to 99. And then when you look at rates of home ownership, when you look at wealth accumulation, when you look at college attendance, when you look at all these barometers of what we consider to be economic, cultural, educational success in the United States, and we see disparities, again, like the action thriller, we fill in the blanks probably wrong as to what's going on there.
Okay. And we have to move on, but I so much to talk about, but we just don't have the time. The essence of this book is just providing a roadmap on how you create and drive social change for a more just future. You began by asking, well, how do we start? You just finished talking about, well, first we got to see the problem. And I loved the second step of dressing for the weather. And that touched my heart because it just made me think, if I am more in tune with what I bring to the table, more confident in my abilities, celebrate myself, it allows me then that when I am going to be hit with that storm or being told something that really is embarrassing or humiliating, ashamed, then I might be able to take it a little bit better. Right. For me, reading this particular chapter basically said that I can love this country, I can love myself, and yet I can critique this country as my mom critiqued me. Am I right in assuming that? I know that my mother loves me just as your mother loved you, but that didn't stop her from, reckoning with me every now and then. But at any
my mom
rate,
still does.
That's where we are as a country, though. If you say something bad about this country, it's sort of like, then you don't love this country. And I think that is kind of what hit to me. But talk a little bit about it, if you don't mind, Dolly. Talk about it from the Anderson, Cooper, and the Ben Affleck scenario.
Sure.
I love how you explain it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just to sort of riff a little bit off of, how our parents, can critique us and love us. And in fact, if our parents, or if we as parents, only see the Instagrammed version of us, of our children, we do them a terrible disservice, right? That kind of like superficial filtered version is not the right way to love a child. It's also not the right way to love a country. In the second, so the book is set up in 7 chapters, 7 different tools for reckoning with our past. And the first one was see the problem, as you described. The second one is dress for the weather. And for that one, I was really struck by the example on the TV show Finding Your Roots, which is hosted by Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. at Harvard. And for those who haven't seen the show, it's a really fascinating. What he does is he brings celebrities on, but then has this like really incredible team of genealogists and researchers and historians who take whatever family history that celebrity knows and like digs deep, like goes into all sorts of archival records and brings up as much as they can, and then presents it kind of on camera to the celebrity, like this big reveal of what their family history is. And often most of the stuff are things the celebrity didn't know. And so there were 2 separate episodes that I contrasted in the book as examples of dressing for the weather, meaning like, was the person appear to be emotionally dressed for the weather of like, let's assume there's going to be some highs and lows in your family history, like just like the rest of us. And there was an example of Ben Affleck, who, and by the way, I don't know Ben Affleck and I don't know Anderson Cooper. And so I'm just going based off of the public record as to what I saw in the video. In Ben Affleck's case, he actually, he learned that a member of his family had enslaved other humans, and there was some associated history in that. And apparently, after the taping was over, We later learned he had asked for that not to be included. And apparently that's not supposed to be a thing. You're not supposed to get to pick and choose what gets included. And so it caused lots of commotion behind the scenes about what they were and weren't going to air. And eventually this all got spilled when there was this huge email leak that this set of emails was part of many other emails that came into the public eye, and we learned that Batman didn't want his family history out there. And so that I contrasted with Anderson Cooper, who also learned that a member of his family had enslaved other humans. And his response appeared to be this really interesting, he was very interested, but it wasn't like he was taking it personally, like it was his fault. He seemed to be able to kind of hold it as something that he needed to just like he took the good news about his ancestors and was like, wow, that's amazing. He was able to also look at this bad news and be like, wow, that's appalling, and able to do both of those in a really balanced way. And so it seemed to me, watching those two clips, that Anderson Cooper had dressed for the weather. He understood enough about our country's history to know that if you're a wealthy family in the a white wealthy family in the United States, in a country where the slave trade was a huge part of our economy for centuries, it's not going to be shocking. Doesn't mean every family was involved, but it's not going to be shocking if a family was involved in the slave trade. He seemed to have kind of the intellectual and emotional preparation for that, whereas Ben Affleck seemed really thrown by it and upset by it. And so dressing for the weather is about, can we emotionally kind of ride out the highs and lows so that we can do the reckoning, and maybe also Dan Gilbert and others have done work on what they call affective forecasting. It was like forecasting of our affect, of our emotions. And one of the things, and this might have been where Dress for the Weather came from, now that I think about it in my head, is like this idea of forecasting the weather. The bottom line of affective forecasting research is that we systematically overestimate how good or bad future emotions are going to feel, and how intensely good or bad they're going to feel, and how long they're going to feel good or bad. We're almost always wrong about it, where it's always flatter than we think it's going to be and shorter than we think it's going to be, and we always recover faster than we think we will, on average. Always is not the right word, on average. And so maybe sort of remembering that, being better affective forecasters would allow us to be a little more like Anderson Cooper, whether it's our personal family's ancestors or just our country as a whole that we're thinking about.
A different play on the word better. So you also said that, it's probably for us who want to be better, that's better than for those of us who want to be good. Does that make sense? Well, you actually wrote it. So I just wanted to see that actually, as I understand that, we often sort of want to stay in this complacency of good, and that doesn't drive change for us.
That's right. That's
Well,
right.
to me, Dolly, I want to be better, but in order for us to be better, we have to actually move to the next steps, embrace the paradox, tear down ourselves in order to build up. And so if you can talk a bit about that and then move to the next section of embracing, connecting and rejecting the fables. Go from there.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. So this idea of for my first book of we have to let go of being a good person so that we can be a better person, and be goodish is how I described it, to have a growth mindset. So we've covered the first section of the book. The first two tools are how do we start, see the problem, and dress for the weather. The second section of the book is what do we do? And as you said, those are embrace paradox, connect the dots, and reject racial fables. Embrace paradox works off of the beautiful research by Wendy Smith, Marianne Lewis, and many others about the ability of the human mind to activate what they call a paradox mindset. And a paradox mindset is one in which you just tell your brain it's okay to let go of our instinct to straighten the picture on the wall, that everything has to kind of line up. In a complicated world, there are often contradictions. And our mind will try to reconcile those unless we give it permission that those contradictions can coexist, or those contradictory statements can coexist. So our founding fathers wrote extraordinary documents, had extraordinary visions, and overcame extraordinary odds. Our founding fathers enslaved other humans. Some of them enslaved other humans while they were doing it. Very uncomfortable for me to say, but both of those things are true. And once we allow both of those things to be true, we activate a paradox mindset. What the research says is that we actually become more resilient and more creative in our problem solving, because we're not like spending all that cognitive energy trying to like solve an unsolvable problem. We can solve the real problems out there. So that's embracing paradox. The tool of connecting the dots relates a little bit to the research I was talking about earlier from Fia Salter and others, of seeing how pages 1 through 99 connect to page 100 onward. And so there it really is about sort of the examination and the asking of why, what is underneath what we're seeing today. Why are neighborhoods racially segregated? Like, in 2023, why is that true? Maybe you could say, well, in the 60s, it was true for segregation. But what's the explanation now? And there are explanations. And so really sort of pushing ourselves to connect dots. And then rejecting racial fables is one in which I don't want to do a spoiler on what's in that chapter, because I think that's a fun little.
Don't do that. Yeah, I
won't. Okay.
I want to bring it up. So it's
okay. I'll just say that chapter offers sort of some experiential learning about racial fables, and with the punchline that there's 3 red flags to look for to know if the narratives that we know to be true might actually be fableized narratives. One is that there's a clear cause and effect, that it looks like it's just sort of this linear cause and effect, when in fact we know that's not usually what happens in complex systems. 2, that there's flawless heroes. Again, there are no flawless people, so a flawless hero is usually a sign of a fable. And then 3, what was the third one? Going blank on my own thing. The third one is good guys beat the bad guys. So this is sort of a sign of that good guys win mindset, or system justification theory. If it always appears that that the victorious were sort of on the side of equality, then chances are we've gotten a fableized version of history. And just to make this a little more concrete, the problem, why it matters, it's not just like fun facts or like, just intellectually curious. If we think that change is linear, if we think that the majority rewards change agents and disruptors, then we will look, if we think that's what happened in the civil rights movement, it is not what happened in the civil rights movement. But if we think it is, because the fable presents it that way, that Muhammad Ali was beloved, he was not beloved by many. If we think Martin Luther King was applauded, he was not applauded by many. He was viewed as moving too fast and was too radical by most white Americans. If we believe that to be true, then we will look at change efforts today in 2023 and think there's something wrong with them if the majority isn't applauding it, or if it's noisy and disruptive, or if it's sometimes moving forward and sometimes moving backward, or if you can't see the clear effects, like there's a protest, but then there's no immediate outcome, then what was the point of the protest? The fable will make it difficult for us to recognize how change happens in the present, because we misunderstood how it happened in the past.
After I finish that section, oh, by the way, to our participants, please feel free to insert your comments and your thoughts and your questions in our Q&A. I like interactive. So please, as you're hearing these things, please chime in and we will incorporate you immediately into the discussion. Now, that being said, Dolly, as I was reading this, I was thinking that, we still are in such a divided state. I was watching CNN this morning, and there was still the divide on the books that should go into the classrooms. There is a divide on the 1619 Project. There is a divide on the narration of the Holocaust and how people are sharing the stories. There still is a great divide.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, from your thought process, how can we begin to tackle this season in which we are in right now? Because I am very hopeful. At the same time, I'm very sad that we are not moving as quick as we should be moving. And so what's your thoughts on still that, it's either yes or no? You're either a patriot or you're not.
I know.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I was on in a rather surreal moment in my life. I was in conversation with Dr. Phil, and he said it, the way he says it is, we need to be a patriot with a to-do list. Rather than the either you are or you aren't, he said we all need to be patriots with a to-do list. And I like thinking of it that way. In terms of kind of this moment we're in, I mean, in some ways, that's exactly, I think it, illustrates in a very exaggerated way what I was feeling on the prairie, like this feeling of, I don't know what to do with these emotions. I don't know how to cope with them in myself. How did I not know this stuff? Now that I know this stuff, what do I do with it? How can I justify my sort of privileged place in society when I know all this? I was feeling all that. And so there's a version of me, I mean, in a sort of cartoonish way, there's a version of me that can imagine going on this real extreme of okay, let's just not talk about it. Or it can't possibly be true, or let's not even put it in our schools. I mean, obviously that's not where I fall, but I can sort of see how if you don't know how to deal with those emotions, that's where you end up. And so to me, this is, it's being discussed as a historical issue, but I think it's a psychological challenge we're facing here is figuring out how to cope with all those emotions. I also think, and there's data from Jay Von Babel and others that show that we're not as polarized as we think on a lot of issues. And so my guess is in the reaction to my book would suggest this, that there's a lot of people out there on both sides of the political divide who are interested in figuring out how to cope with these issues. The Wall Street Journal ran a year in review section. They always run a year in review section. And the 2022 issue, they asked me to write a piece about my book. And the Wall Street Journal is not known for being a sort of liberal paper. And I got lots. And so I talked about some of the tools that we're discussing here in this printed piece. And I got lots of emails from Wall Street Journal readers who were very much engaging in exactly this thought process. So I think I'm not trying to dismiss that there are some real extreme loud voices out there. And I wish I knew the answer there. I don't. But I do think there's lots of people trying to figure it out who aren't in the extremes.
Okay. I'm hopeful for that, darling.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had strategies. I tend to write for people who are open to learning, and I don't say that as like a badge of anything. It's just sort of what I know how to do. But there is also a need to address people who are not open to learning, and I'm not sure I'm as skilled or experienced in doing that.
You know what? You just touched on a question that I received. I did a opening session with one of the new cohorts coming into Stern, and that question came to me: how do you address people who are not open to learn? Now, here's my response. I learned this in a course in South Africa, that we made the assumption that they were not open to learn based on our perceptions. And I'm not saying that they weren't, but then how you grapple with the fact that I'm believing one way and you're believing in another. And so my perception of you is that you're just closed down.
Yeah.
That person's perception of me could actually be the same way.
Yeah.
And so then how do we grapple with the fact of, the next step if we both are stuck in our ways?
Yeah.
Yeah. But what I love about this fact is you had mentioned at the early stage of your book that you are not a historian. And you
Mhm.
touched on the element of the fact that you have to go back to reflect on historical moments in order to use them as examples of the tools you need in order to see the problem and to embrace paradox. And so, why did you emphasize the fact that you were not a historian?
Oh, well, I mean, because I'm really not. I mean, like, I wasn't even like a really very good like high school history student. I mean, I sort of was good at taking tests and getting assignments done so I could get to basketball practice. Like, I really was not super engaged in the subject. So I think one reason is I just want to be transparent about what I am and I'm not expert in. But the other reason is I think I'm like a lot of people. Like, I'm not coming at this from a place of like, I'm going to go read my 12th volume, my 12 volume, series about World War II. Like, that's not what I do. Like, I'm just trying to understand. This is just about my emotional relationship with my country. And that happens to involve our history. So for that reason, I have to engage with history, and so do the rest of us. And I think that took me 50 some years to realize about myself that this has nothing to do with am I or am I a historian or even a history buff. It has to do with if I love this country, the only way I'm going to understand it and help make it better and be what I call, I'm sort of skipping to the end, a gritty patriot, someone who has passion and perseverance for the meaningful long-term goal of making our country better. The only way I'm going to do that is by having a better sense of pages 1 to 99.
So we have our first comment and a question for you, and I love this to get us started. The deep issue is not only how we cope with the emotions that are associated with the reckoning, but more critically, how and at what ages do we educate our children on these issues? This seems to be part of the hot button for the book bans.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're the same question. I think if we as adults knew how to do it, we would be able to do it with our kids. We do it from the beginning. I mean, we talk to our kids since they're little. We talk to them about good guys and bad guys and fights and fair play, and this is that conversation. It's obviously done age appropriately, without sort of traumatizing graphics. Graphic detail, but to say that this country took advantage of people took advantage of their labor, took advantage of their lack of freedom because we enslaved them. I don't think that's something we have to wait to tell kids. I think we need to tell them.
All right, they're coming in. How do you relate the light versus heat concept that you talked about in your first book to the topics of your second book around building a more just future in quite a divided society?
Yeah, Joanne, with the deep cut question, thank you. So in my first book, I talk about heat and light being a metaphor that many have used to describe different ways of influencing change. Light is meeting people where they are, and heat is sort of pushing people beyond where they're comfortable. And so light is more incremental, heat is more disruptive. And I have a hypothesis, I've not collected any data on this, that light changes minds and heat changes systems. And I think it relates actually really well to the second book, in the sense that in a couple of ways. One is that, you know how earlier I was saying like the fableized version of the civil rights movement? That fableized version is one in which we picture it as only having light. Like, that's what seems to get lost in the fables, is the heat. When we look back, we think it was about light. And then we think that now what should be happening is only light. But in fact, the reality was it was light and heat. And what historians who study social movements have found is that when there's a balance of light and heat, there tends to be more change made than if there's, it's skewed towards light or skewed towards heat, which was a real interesting learning for me. It was my first book. And so it's interesting that one of the things we have to watch out for with racial fables is this dilution of the heat, as if there was only light that took place. And we need to remember that both light and heat are important tools in the present to sort of pushing for the change we need.
Fables actually are getting in our way because you actually also talked about that the change of the past resulted in division. Not, we all on one accord, so while we want to be unified, it's hard to implement change. That's a complex thing for me to say. It's hard to implement change if you're unified. It is better that change will be implemented if there's a divisive element. So actually, if that's the case, then I'm hoping change is right around the corner or beginning to, because we are in a height of division.
We are, yeah.
We're about to hopefully see some elements of change, hopefully.
Yeah, I think exactly. So the idea, of course, is not that divisiveness is good for divisiveness' sake, but is to remember that the Civil War was divisive. The Civil Rights Movement was divisive. Like almost every significant change that we now applaud in hindsight was divisive at the time. Again, that's what gets sort of flattened in the fable. And it's actually maybe also useful. There's research on the hindsight bias that I talk about in A More Just Future, which I think is really interesting. It's this tendency, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on whose research it is, and I'm embarrassed by that, but it is cited in the book. The hindsight bias is our tendency to look at all the possible past that could have led to this present moment. But of course, there was just one past that happened and all the other ones didn't. This is like that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once kind of thing. But only one path or past has led to now. And in hindsight, we see it as the only one that ever could have happened, the hindsight bias. And so, for example, if we live at a time right now where, let me just come up with an example, where women, have credit cards. Well, in my lifetime, when I was a kid, women did not have credit cards in their own name. They weren't allowed to have credit cards in their own name, as I understand, when I was a child. And it's hard for me to imagine that wouldn't have changed by now, but it is possible that it wouldn't have. My hindsight bias makes it hard for me to see a different present. So I think that's also important to think about when we think about divisiveness, is that it's easy to be like, well, we didn't need the divisiveness to get the change because of our hindsight bias.
Well, I have one more question, and we'll open it up for questions and thoughts from our participants. And that is sort of recap, where do we start? Well, we see the problem, we dress for the weather. We begin to embrace the fact that there can be a both and, as opposed to an either or. Connect the dots, reject those fables. And where do we go from here? The two final things: take responsibility. And you had touched on it in building grit. I love the word grit. So if you can just sort of put that down as a closing thought, and then we can open up for any thoughts that the participants may have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so in the final part of the book that you're describing, the where do we go from here, the take responsibility chapter builds a lot off of Isabel Wilkerson's work. Isabel Wilkerson won the Pulitzer Prize for her journalism, and she wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, which is this phenomenal oral history of the Great Migration. And most recently, she wrote the book Caste. And she uses this metaphor of an old house, that if, let's say, you were to buy an old house and you love this old house, and it's, this dream that you've had to live in a house like this. And then one day there's something in the basement, there's some leak in the basement or some sound in the basement or whatever. you wouldn't just ignore it and say, well, that was the previous owner's problem. That clearly, there's nothing we did that caused that problem in the basement. You would go and deal with it and tear your hair out and be like, this basement, and and bemoan the cost and the time and the hassle. But you would deal with the basement. And I say this having lived in an old house with basement like this. And so the take responsibility chapter sort of borrows her metaphor of this old house, and notice the little callback to the Little House on the Prairie, and sort of invites us to consider, as she has, our country as this old house. And so whether or not we were, a recent immigrant to this country, or we've been here for generations, whether or not our family was involved in things that we are or are not proud of, whatever it is the country that we are now in. And so how can we take responsibility for this old house? How can we reckon with what's here? How can we be clearer about, what do reparations look like? And I'm myself, sort of in a growth state of trying to understand what reparations are and how we would think about that. But one of the things that's been very persuasive to me is Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing about, before you can think about doing reparations, you have to do the reckoning part. You have to do the accounting. You actually have to figure out, and he argues, the economic, what was stolen in economic terms. And so I've become convinced that is an important undertaking, and that comes with taking responsibility, is doing that kind of work. It's also rather extraordinary that in the United States of America, there's never been a formal apology for slavery. I mean, isn't that just blows my mind?
Yeah.
Why? I mean, so that's what taking responsibility is about. And then the final chapter, to build grit, is about being a gritty patriot, as we talked about earlier. And there I'm building off of psychologist Angela Duckworth's research on grit, and marrying it with the concept of patriotism, which is sometimes like it's what the colors we wear or the holidays we celebrate. I'm trying to sort of marry it with this more active way of being and thinking of the Dr. Phil's, love your country with a to-do list. And I had the opportunity to interview George Takei, who, Star Trek fans will remember, and then he somehow remained sort of an important figure in the United States now for the last 40, 50 years. His family, when he was a small child, was incarcerated in internment camps where Japanese Americans were imprisoned for the possibility they might commit treason, not for having actually committed treason. He spent several years, as did his family. They lost their home, they lost their livelihood, they lost everything. And he has spent much of his life trying to educate the rest of us on how that happened and how it could happen again if we don't understand it. And in interviewing him for my book, I was really struck by, and this is actually where the word grit popped in my head. I was like, gosh, he's gritty. Like, he speaks with such love for this country and so much investment and activity in trying to make the country better, despite, the ways in which he has been so terribly wronged, in my mind, at the hands of our government. And that's where gritty patriot kind of came from, was sort of seeing him in action in that way.
Richard says divisiveness, perhaps that is the element that we tend to leave out of our teaching of history. Like you, I was uninterested in history, but now many new authors are painting a much more useful and more nuanced description of history. Do you have any insight into how the teaching of history has evolved in schools and universities?
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for the question. I should be clear. I am not only am I not a historian, I'm not an expert in the teaching of history or how it's taught, or in kids specifically. So I have a general sense that's not based off of any scholarly study that there are more primary sources being used, on more more perspectives being included, at least in some schools. I certainly see it in my own kids, and I sort of, in the epilogue of the book, sort of take the reader back to my kids. And even though I failed to kind of give them a balanced view, they seem to have emerged thanks to teachers and activists and TikTokers and people out there seem to have given them a more balanced view than I did at home. And so, you know, I see hope in that. But I wish I had a better answer for Richard on this. I don't think that's in my answer.
Well, Richard, this is not the answer, but you just prompted me just to go on page 104 where we talk about the Marley hypothesis, Buffalo Soldier.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the words of Buffalo Soldier basically says that when I analyze the stench, to me, it makes a lot of sense. And that's the core of the Marley hypothesis that actually, correct me if I'm wrong, researchers came up with that hypothesis. But
Yeah.
to make it clear, it talks about the notion of ignorance of the past leads to the denial of the present. Ignorance of racism leads to denial of it in the present.
Right.
And I just think that that's just a powerful statement in terms of you have to grapple, or else you're going to remain in this narrative that doesn't do any good of moving us forward. Dolly, I want you to conclude with what you talked about in the notion of your prologue, the love for your country. I think that was a special, and I think that's great of how you ended it, because you went deep in this book.
Mm-hmm.
But you brought it back home that actually also validated the fact that you wouldn't have written it had you not loved this place and loved the people in it. So if you want to just conclude, and then we can let the participants go on about their day.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate, Victor, the thoughtfulness of your questions. You know, one of the things that I discovered, and by discovered, I mean, I didn't know, but it was out there. My parents immigrated from India in the late 1960s. I was actually born in India and was 6 months old when they came here. And I grew up with this understanding in the Indian American community that there had been this change in U.S. immigration law, and that change had, my father has a petroleum engineering degree, and they needed engineers and doctors, and the government went to India and was like, please, engineers and doctors, won't you please come to the United States? And that we sort of obliged. And I mean, I'm being a little silly about it, but like that was the general understanding I had. And that there certainly was a very clear kind of spike in immigration in the late 60s. So that was not imagined, and it was of doctors and engineers. But what I didn't know until I was working on this book was that what actually happened was after the 1964 change, civil rights legislation in the United States, there was a push by some that immigration laws should also have not favor white immigrants over non-white immigrants, which they currently did. They favored European immigrants over immigrants from other countries. And so there was a battle in the US and then in Congress about this that led to all sorts of worries that were pretty explicitly stated that they would start getting immigrants from Asia and Africa, and then promises made to those saying, no, let's just make this change in the law. It's not really going to happen. It's things, our demographics in the United States as a white Christian nation will stay the same, but at least the law will sort of appease those who are upset about this. And so the change was made in the law that allowed my family to come here. But we were not actually sort of as sought after as I grew up thinking. And so what's really interesting to me is that there's lots of communities, and I would say the Indian American community might be one of these communities where there's segments of us who didn't realize how closely tied our interests are to the civil rights movement. And that we weren't, in fact, the sort of the sort of orthogonal immigrant group. We were the direct beneficiary, and I didn't know that growing up. And I think that's another example of kind of a fableized version with a sort of sub-narrative within an immigrant community. I grew up in a home where love of country was discussed often, love of both countries that I affiliate with, but that America was the greatest country on earth. I heard over and over, and I still hear over and over, and I love this country. But I think it's really interesting how even in my own mind and heart and home and culture, kind of that love of country got fableized along the way.
Dolly, Rob did say that we can finish up at 12:58.
Yes.
I do want to acknowledge Alex Danto and his comment.
Yes.
As in her book, Professor Chugh emphasizes the importance of not ignoring the cracks or discarding shards in American society. She argues that we need to address the flaws in our society in a constructive manner. In light of the deep polarization in our society and how we deal with those who hold different political, religious, or racial views, could you elaborate more on how you activate a growth mindset, recognizing ordinary privilege and engaging with others?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Danto, for what sounds like a really careful read of my work. I mean, I will, again, I'm not sure I have all the answers to the deep polarization question, but I do think we have more influence than we think with people who are, like most of us, kind of trying to figure it out in the middle. And the thing that I have found most powerful in those conversations is to make our own learning visible to others. And what that means is be willing to acknowledge there were things we didn't know that we know now. There were beliefs we used to have that we've let go of. There's unlearning we've done ourselves. So that if we're asking others to do that, it's not from a place of preaching, it's from a place of solidarity. And I found that to be tremendously effective. And there's also research that says that we underestimate how effective it is to confront other people, even when the conversation feels unpleasant at the time, that there's some data saying that they do make changes after that conversation, even though the unpleasant conversation would lead us to believe that we had no impact at all. So I would offer both of those tidbits.
Rob, you can come back in, but I'm going to leave by Ruth's comment that says that she loved the concept of fableize.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ruth.
Dolly and Victor, thank you both so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot. And so thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with all of us. Thank you very much to everybody who joined for the program. It was great to have you here. For our next event, the Center for the Future of Management is excited to host NBA Africa CEO Victor Williams for a virtual fireside chat on basketball and business development across Africa. That event is March 7th at 3 p.m. More details are available on our website, stern.nyu.edu/CFM. That's all for today. Thank you again, Dolly and Victor. Thank you to everybody who joined, and goodbye. Have a good week, everybody.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Victor. You're both wonderful.
Thank you.